as the Rockets lost one of their great coaches this week, who was also an all-time great NBA coach. Bill Fitch, who still called the Houston area home, lived out in Conroe. Fitch ranks number 10th all-time in NBA victories, was twice NBA Coach of the Year, and coached the third most games in NBA history. Bill Fitch, Hall of Fame coach. Before he came to the Rockets, he was the head coach of the expansion Cleveland Cavaliers in 1970, and in just 6 years led them to a conference championship. Then he took over a 29-win Celtics team, and in his first year, he beat the 81 Rockets team in the NBA Finals. He came to a 14-win Rockets team in 1983, and by his third season, he had the Rockets in the NBA Finals after pulling off that huge upset over Magic and Cream's Lakers in the conference finals. Listen to what some of his contemporaries had to say about the Hall of Famer. You're going to hear Sampson, and then that's Ralph Sampson, not Kelvin. Ralph Sampson, and then Lenny Wilkins, and then ex-Rockets coach Kevin McHale, and finally Larry Bird.
He understood the process to win. And when you can go to multiple teams and build a legacy, coaches like that are very rare.
Bill always wanted to be better, and the guys dubbed him Captain Video because he watched more video than any coach I had ever seen.
He was ahead of the game, and preparation was as good as any. He didn't leave any stone unturned.
Get up! Get up right now!
He was very demanding, but he made you very accountable, and he made everybody on the team very accountable to each other.
I love him very much. The guy's special.
Again, those last two voices, Kevin McHale and Larry Legend. Bird called Bill Fitch the best coach he ever had. Larry Bird said that. There's no higher praise. And Stephen, before we get to your memories of Fitch, I got to share this with you. I had a short conversation with Houston Post Rockets beat writer Robert Falkoff, who covered the team from 80 to 95. He was around Fitch and all of those teams that Fitch coached with the Rockets every day of the Fitch tenure.
A miraculous shot by Ralph Sampson has given the Houston Rockets a trip to Boston for the NBA World Title.
Well, let me start out with you, Robert. What do you remember about Bill when he was hired, and what kind of guy that Bill Fitch was?
Well, a very enigmatic personality. On one hand, he had the Irish dry wit. He could be very, very charming, but also very, very tough-minded, and a guy that really wanted everyone around him to be all in the way he was. And that even went for reporters. So just a very Marine-like, old-school personality, which served him well in a lot of ways. And then in some ways, it would come back to bite him. But he was the right guy for the right time, just starting out with, he got the job. He knew that Ralph Sampson was coming, Rodney McRae. The next year they were able to draft Olajuwon and put together this magical run in 85, 86. And probably my second favorite Rocket team was the 86 team, second only to the 94 team that won the NBA championship. But Bill was one of a kind. He was, I had a great relationship with him. Most of the time, he got mad at me twice. One time when I wrote an article with quoting Ralph Sampson and saying, well, we practice too long, our practices, we have dead legs. And then he had a habit of, when those kind of things would happen, he would ask a player who had made controversial statements to stand up and read the article in front of the team. So he did that one time with Sampson, one time with Mitchell Wiggins, who criticized the offense. And so you could just imagine nowadays how that would go over with players and the Players Association. But that was Bill. He just was a grinder. They would stay up after games, the assistant coaches, I would feel sorry for them, watching the film until 2, 3 in the morning. And that was the days before charter flights. And so they might have to have a 6 o'clock commercial flight to go somewhere. They'd be up till 2, 3 in the morning watching film. So very, very demanding on himself, but also on his coaching staff and on his players.
You talked about him being a drill sergeant. He was a ex-Marine drill sergeant, in fact. So that was his history. And, I'm just curious because he had so much success in Boston. He'd won the championship. Why did he leave Boston? Because that one always made no sense to me, because it was just a couple of years after they'd won the championship against the Rockets. And you watched that. You'd cover that series.
Well, what happens is Bill would come in and just because of the way he coached, he would wear out his welcome. The players, they would take it for a while, but then after they have success, like Boston won the championship, well, then the next year they won in 81. They beat the Rockets for the championship. Well, 82, they lost to Philly. 83, they didn't do it again. And Casey Jones, the assistant coach, was more of a laid-back guy. And so I think under the surface, although they didn't really come out with that, I think the players kind of nudged Bill out. The interesting thing about, though, coming to Houston was that the Rockets actually offered that job. This was after Dale Harris got fired, to Tommy Heinsohn, who was a Celtic broadcaster. Tommy Heinsohn was going to be the guy, and it was all set. He came down, did a big interview, but he got cold feet because of some things that were talked about, that he had some unconventional philosophies, and the management kind of, I don't know about this. So it ended up that Heinsohn pulled back. And when he did, at the 11th hour, that's when the job went to Bill Fitch. So kind of ironic that, another Boston guy was going to get the job, Tommy Heinsohn, and because he pulled back, it ended up being Bill Fitch.
You saw him on a day-to-day basis in Houston. He wore out his welcome. He was tough. You say all that, but what do you think made him so successful? What did you see about his coaching that worked? I mean, was it the X's and O's thing? Was it his personal relationship with the players and being able to get the most out of them? What do you remember about what worked with him as a coach?
He was a tough love guy. I mean, he was very, very hard on guys. He didn't give them a lot of, praise. His philosophy was, it's kind of an animalistic business, that you just keep them on edge. And that worked for him as I said, for the most part, especially when they put together that 85-86 run and went to the finals. Fitch was able to incorporate his philosophy, his style, his work ethic. I think that's basically what made him successful. He took a guy like Lewis Lloyd, who wasn't a good defensive player, but a great offensive player. And Lou worked hard on defense. He got him to buy in. Lloyd did a great job on Magic Johnson in the Western Conference Finals in 86. So just things like that, to be able to bring Wiggins off the bench. He knew, I go back to, I talked to Red Auerbach when Fitch got hired in Houston. I called him up, and at that time, Red was still able to do interviews and stuff. And he just said, Bill just knows what he's doing. You give him the right pieces and he's going to win. And he did, for the most part. Like I said, when they lost the three guards, top three guards after the 86 season, or during, Lucas in March of 86, and then Lloyd and Wiggins the following year. That is so devastating, because you got three guys that are part of your rotation and you've got no compensation. It's like, if you traded those guys, how much you would get back, but you got nothing back. So it just left a gaping hole in the roster, and they kept trying to rectify it, and it just really wasn't going to happen. And so it was just his style, his belief in how he did things, the grind, the work ethic, the ability to keep guys motivated for the most part. They called him, a builder, but not a maintainer. And I think that pretty well holds true. I think that's what he was.
Last thing before I let you go, you had a really interesting fact, because we just, in the last few years, we've lost Charlie Thomas and Ray Patterson, some of the other key figures for those teams. Tell everybody what you texted me after Bill Fitch died.
Well, yeah, it just stuck me, because each of those guys, those were the three movers and shakers in the organization in the 80s. And I just remember, when Charlie died and Ray Patterson, I actually, was able to go to Ray's memorial service in 2011, and then Bill, and it was all in the headlines. All three of them died, strangely but true, at the age of 89. So you really mourn their passing. All of them were great guys, people that I enjoyed knowing personally and working with. So you mourn them on one side. On the other side, you say, hey, almost 90 years old, all of them. So they all lived a very fruitful and rich life. And if you get to 89 or 90 years old, that's pretty good.
I'm back with Stephen. And Stephen, before I got off the line with Falkoff, he told me that while Fitch coached the Rockets, he lived in a Greenway Plaza building where he could just go across a walkway to the summit. So as you can imagine, Fitch practically lived in the summit and had his assistants out there till 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning most nights.
Yeah, I imagine his family probably totally forgot who he was. And, I remember the whole captain video thing. I mean, even back then, they talked about that a lot. And, as I think about Bill Fitch, Robert, and you alluded to this earlier, but the guy just won. I mean, when you can take the Cleveland Cavaliers, a team that for the most part in the 70s was as much a laughingstock as anybody in the NBA, and make them a winner, Bill Fitch just won everywhere he went. I mean, some people just have that it factor, and Bill Fitch had it. And, it's amazing. And Robert was saying that the 86 team, as far as he was concerned, was his second favorite team to the 94. I'd have to agree. When I look at that Rockets team of 86, it kind of reminds me of those late 70s teams of the Houston Oilers. The Oilers were probably better than everybody else except the Pittsburgh Steelers. Well, the Rockets 86 team, they proved they were better than everybody else except the Boston Celtics. They weren't going to beat the Celtics. They were just too good. But beyond that, man, Bill Fitch had them in a position where, if a couple of things had fallen the other way, the Rockets might have upset the Celtics. I mean, they took him to 6 games. So, yeah, what a coach. Maybe not always that likable, but he won, and he was dedicated, maybe to a fault, quite frankly.
Yeah, Sampson got hurt in the series. That didn't help. But, hey, arguably the best team in NBA history, that 86 Celtics team. They had Bill Walton on the bench.
Yeah, I'm just saying that it was kind of like those Steelers teams of the late 70s. I mean, nobody was going to beat them, but at least the Rockets came close to beating the Celtics. And, it's pretty ironic that you have Bill Fitch coaching the Celtics to a championship against the Rockets in 81, and then he turns around and coaches the Rockets in the finals against the 86 Celtics. I mean, you just don't hear about that a lot, Robert.
You forget about the Celtics connections because, we heard McHale earlier. McHale coached the Rockets. Danny Ainge and some of these other figures from that Celtics era are still hanging around. Danny Ainge over with Utah. He's looking to make some move with the Jazz at the deadline. You've got Mitchell Wiggins, who Robert mentioned, the drug suspension, the sad ending to his career with the drugs and all of that sort of thing. You got his son over at Golden State, who just made the All-Star team, controversially made the All-Star team. And Andrew Wiggins, you've got John Lucas, who's such a huge part of what the Rockets are doing right now and trying to turn things around with them and young guys in the same way that Lucas was around that team trying to turn everything around back in the early 80s. So, just all of that connection. And I got one more great Fitch story for you, Stephen. There's a statue of him at the Hall of Fame near the other great coaches and near James Naismith's statue. That statue of Bill Fitch was paid for $150,000 by Rick Carlisle. Now, if you go back to 1989, Fitch cut Carlisle when he was a player for the New Jersey Nets. The story goes that after Fitch cut him, Carlisle, he goes, you're cut, in the gruff Fitch way, and Carlisle started to give a speech thanking Fitch for what he did for him. He's like rehearsing it, and then he says it out loud. But then right before he starts to say anything, Fitch stops him, and he barks at Carlisle, and he goes, wait, I'm not done yet. And then he offered Carlisle an assistant coaching job. And as they say, the rest is history. And Falkoff reminded me that it was Carlisle who pushed for Fitch with the Hall of Fame committee to get him into Springfield.
Well, that just goes to show you, what a great judge of character and talent Bill Fitch was. I mean, not just on the court, but he obviously saw something in Rick Carlisle that he would make a good coach. And, it's interesting. I mean, you don't hear stories like that very often. And yeah, in the gruff Bill Fitch way, Carlisle thought his time was done. But yeah, it's just another testament to the character of Bill Fitch and just the intelligence that he had when it came to the game of basketball.
And again, I cannot thank Robert Falkoff enough. He's just a walking encyclopedia of that entire era.
He really is. I mean, I remember he was with the Houston Post, which of course has been folded for a long time. But, I remember his writings in the Houston Post. And I think he even did, he was on the pregame show of Rockets Radio back in the 70s and 80s. I used to listen to him. A very distinct voice. I mean, I know when I hear Robert Falkoff, I immediately recognize it's him.
You're listening to Houston Sports Talk.